Before we get into today's episode, I just want to give you a quick content warning that our conversations today will touch on stolen generations, colonisation, and child removal. G'day, I'm Uncle Charles Pakana, and welcome everyone to our very first episode of the Peeneyt Bubup podcast. I'm joined today by a dear friend, Gunditjmara woman, and the head of the Balit Durn Centre, Auntie Sheree Lowe. Auntie Sheree, if I can pass to you for an acknowledgement of country, and then if you can kickstart also the introductions.
Thanks, Uncle Charles. We would just like to acknowledge that we're recording today on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, pay respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge their continued connection to their land over generations. We'd also like to acknowledge that wherever you're listening to this podcast, you're listening to it on Aboriginal lands, lands that were never ceded. Maybe I might take us a little bit in the name of the podcast, Uncle Charles.
I think that'd be a great idea. It sounds great, but what does it actually mean?
So the team and I at VACCHO, we were thinking about what are the key messages that we want to get from the podcast. It's really important to acknowledge the important role of kinship carers in our community, but also the important role of families and in particular children. So we have used the mother tongue of my language, so one of my languages of Karewarong, so down in southwest of Victoria. In Peeneyt is strong and strength, and what is really important and what we see in our children. And Boop Boop is baby. So bringing them together, strong babies means strong communities and strong future.
Perfect name for the podcast. 2025 really brought us here in a big way, and some conversations that VACCHO had with kinship carers. Let's just understand what happened and what were some of the driving messages that led us to where we are right now.
So back in 2025, we our small little team reached out to carers. I think we had a conversation with the department, and there was an expectation of setting up a network, but we didn't know whether that's what they needed. So we started the conversation to have an understanding. Wanted to yarn with kinship carers. We had some surveys as well. We talked to carers in regional and metro, and just wanted to get a bit of a sense about their challenges, what's been successful, and what do they need, really, is at the core of it all.
And a lot of those things that you heard during those conversations, those yarning sessions, are actually going to be reflected in future episodes of this particular podcast. So it will be very important to follow us along for the next 8 particular episodes. And look, over the next 8 episodes, Sheree and I will be speaking to a large number of experts in their own particular fields, all relating to childcare and kinship caring. We'll be talking about things such as tips and tricks on dealing with trauma and difficult behaviour. We'll also be looking at ways in which you can better navigate the various systems that really impact on what you're seeking to achieve. But most importantly of all, I think, and you'd have to agree with me here, is that we need to keep hearing from these kinship carers out there. But what about you? Let's hear a bit about you before we get into the real guts of the podcast today.
Well, the least favourite topic of the podcast to talk about is to talk about myself. But for those who don't know, my name's Sheree Lowe. I'm Djapurrong Gunditjmara, in particular Karewarong and Peekwarong, so the eastern part of Gunditjmara Nation. So those who are unfamiliar with those names, if you think about in the southwest of Victoria, starting kind of, near 12 Apostles on the Great Ocean Road, and follow that around to Port Fairy, come inwards, and up through the country on the Melbourne side of Garryword or Grampians, and then coming back around to just outside of Ballarat is Djapurrong country. So if you think about that, that's my cultural footprint. But I was born and raised in Ballarat on Wadawurrung country, and pay respects to that mob who's kind of kept me safe and my family safe for the many years that I've lived there. And through my working journey, I've had a whole number of roles, but the roles all have a focus on centering around connection, advocacy for our people. I have a really strong focus on social justice and the importance of that, but also really about how do we transform these Western systems that aren't serving our people well, and how can we transform that and take people on a journey to be able to understand us better and hopefully shift the paradigm that we're not having to fit into their systems, that the systems change to allow us to be who we are. So then in that journey, I found myself at VACCHO. 5 years ago, I started my role there. And what brought me there was some specific focus on the Royal Commission into
Yep.
Victoria's mental health system. And in particular, the importance of healing for our community.
Mm.
And so that's taken me on a path which has led me here today to talk about, in some ways, healing for our kinship carers, but also healing for our families and children. So I'm really pleased with the team and the work that they've done, and importantly, working with kinship carers to hear directly from them on, what's important to them, what do they need, how do they need to be supported, because they play such an important role in our community.
I'm interested, Auntie Sheree, that you mentioned Ballarat, or Ballarat as it's more commonly known, and the important role that people in that area had in keeping you safe. And that's such an important part of our community, isn't it? That we do feel safe, we do feel secure. And it's a part of what we're going to be talking about in these episodes in the future, is that caring and that nurturing. So it's important that people do understand that has been an important part of your life. But before we let you off the hook, and before I get to the uncomfortable part of introducing myself, I think it's also worth noting that you served a term in the First People's Assembly of Victoria, now known as Gulingwal. Tell us a little bit about that and the influence that had really in you.
It's kind of an interesting question, and now I'm in a position to be able to reflect on that as I'm just finishing up my
Yeah.
term as Gulingwal has been established, which is really exciting. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but when I was elected in, and probably after I'd had my inaugural speech in Parliament House, I just felt that that was the right place for me to be at that time.
Yeah.
And as you'll hear throughout the course of the podcast, I really believe that there's bigger energies than just us here and the physical being, and that there are really strong ancestral connections that guide us to do the work that we do. And something that's really important for me in the messaging that I carry for people is, um, we all have a role in community.
Yeah.
Sometimes we haven't been instilled in that role, and we're a little bit lost, and takes a bit of time on figuring that out. Like, where is our place? Where do I belong? What was, the purpose of us, or, the expectations of our ancestors on us as people? And if you think traditionally, that's what served us as Aboriginal people.
Very much. Yeah.
It's the key to our survival, our resilience in being able to be quite clear about those roles and having clear roles and rules. I know that sounds very kind of, unfun in some ways, but it's what's kept us true. And, here we are, the longest living culture in the world. And that's kind of those core values have really held us stead. So it's when we think about treaty, that's an exciting time for us, because it is about being able to reset that relationship. And I think that's really important.
And a lot of what Auntie Sheree has spoken about just then will be recurring throughout the various episodes of this particular podcast. So before we get into the very first real meat of the first podcast, I'll introduce myself. I'm Uncle Charles Pakana. I'm actually what's referred to somewhat distastefully as a disconnected Aboriginal man. My mob comes from Tasmania, but I'm disconnected from there as a result of colonial activities over the past several hundred years. But I'm really proud to have been almost adopted, or welcomed, I should say, by various Victorian traditional owner communities. So I'm a very proud and fiercely proud Victorian Aboriginal man. I'm a journalist, I'm a podcaster, I'm a radio broadcaster, and I get the absolute delight in my life of sitting down with people like Auntie Sheree and yarning about everything from strengthening kinship caring to treaty as well. So there's a lot more coming up in the podcast, and we really hope that you get a lot from it. I just want to step back about a week or so to a yarn that you and I had at VACCHO talking about this project in particular. And something you said really resonated with me and swung me in 100% support of this particular project. And that was when you were talking about the Aboriginal children themselves, that when they come into this world, they've been touched by the ancestors, they've been touched by the spirits, and they embody everything that we as Aboriginal people hold so dear. And I think it would be great for the audience if you were to just talk a little bit about that and help position where and why we're coming from this point.
Thanks, Uncle Charles. Yes, it was a good conversation a little while ago. And I think that for us, in its simplest forms, that our Burais, Bubups are the gifts from our
Yeah.
ancestors. They are gifted to us to help with what we need, even when we don't know what we need. Um, and I think that from the moment they're gifted to us, as first peoples of this now known country of Australia, comes roles and responsibilities,
Mm.
but also cultural obligations and cultural needs in a way. And unfortunately, through colonisation, that's been disrupted for a lot of people. That connection, um, that sense of belonging and sense of place. And in particular, when we talk about our children who have been placed in care situations, some removed from families completely, but some sitting within the kinship structure, informally and formally, that the kinship carers have a really important role to be able to maintain and to instill and to help grow and nurture culturally strong little people who then will become our future elders, right? But what we also know is really important is that our kinship carers need help to be able to navigate that as well. Because when we talk about kinship placement, it's not only within our Aboriginal families, but it's with that child's extended family. So although sitting with kinship and family, which is really important, they may be sitting in a family with a non-Aboriginal family,
Yeah.
their family, but the non-Aboriginal part of their family who might need some of that guidance around those cultural connections. It's a stated right in the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous People. We have a right to our culture. We have a right to practice culture. We have a right to country. And it's really important that we maintain and hold that for our Burais, but also for, the strength and future of our communities.
If I can get a little bit contentious for a bit, when you were talking about the importance of ensuring that our Bubups and Burais maintain that connection and have that, I'll paraphrase a bit, that cultural upbringing, it seems to me also that if we fail to do that, are we not really falling into the trap that was set for us so long ago when it was to eliminate us from the very land that we've inhabited for 65,000 years, and that to be done by removing our culture, removing our children, removing our families. So this project itself, this kinship caring, this bringing our young ones, regardless of their situation, into culture, it seems that it's a very important way forward to ensure that we do have that ongoing presence in this country.
100%. And it's not an easy task. And having those responsibilities of being that kinship carer. Traditionally, um, if we think about the roles of carers and just community, it wasn't just a mum and dad raising a child. Like that's a really
Yep.
Western kind of view. It's very insular and individual. And um, as people know, we're quite holistic and interconnected. And, our kinship structures actually talk to that broader role of caring and responsibility. So it's important to note that there's aspects of that that have, been brought forward in a contemporary setting. It's just sat within a system that, yeah, that hasn't fed well for our people, that doesn't allow culture to be nurtured. It doesn't recognize culture as a protective factor. There are many documents that talk about that, but seeing that in actual practice, it's patchy. There's some examples of where that's done well, examples of where it's done not well at all. And so, what's really important is that we challenge those systems, um, to be able to, I guess, bring to the forefront those key principles for
Yeah.
those children and the people that are supporting them, and in this case, the kinship carers. But we also know in navigating that it- and navigating that space around cultural connections and belonging and those types of things can be quite stressful. It can be quite challenging.
And
I
that's
don't,
sorry, that's for everybody involved. That's for the
yeah.
children and for the carers, isn't it? It's
Mm.
important to state that.
Because you've got to remember that when a child's removed, it changes those relationships and the dynamics of
Yeah, of
that family
course.
forever.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of work to be able to, um, reconcile past that. Whether it's, nans and pops or aunties and uncles taking care of grannies or, cousins, kids, nephews, nieces, whatever the relationship is. And so then where does the parents fit into that role? How do you explain those conversations? Because in a kinship structure, it's more often than not that the family's still going to be quite close in some ways. The parents, you'll see them in community, you'll see them at family events. Like, how do you navigate those spaces
Mm.
of roles? And um, I think as Aboriginal people that we have a clear understanding of what that looks like. We have our own ways of risk assessments and those types of things if we want to use Western language of reading, scenarios and, that judgment of what fares people well. Um, what's a safe community setting and what's not. We know those things. What are safe places, who are um, our strengths and guiders, our cultural knowledge holders and those types of things. But um, systems don't seem to pick up on that. And more often than not, systems try to steer us away from that. And so then going back to your point that more often than not, yeah, it does feel like that we're living assimilation policies in
Mm.
2026. Um, I wasn't around then, so I don't know when assimilation policy, stolen generation was in full force. So I can't reflect on you know, what the narrative was at that time, but I definitely, feel the impacts of that. And there's not a day and not a conversation that I have that, isn't touched by stolen generation and that displacement of people and country on what we do. It's just framed in different ways, but in the core, it all comes back to that.
Without a doubt. Auntie Sheree, one of the other things you also mentioned during that yarn we've referenced that we had last week is that caring for Aboriginal children is actually a way or an important part of honouring our ancestors. And I think before we get on to the next subject, it's really worth just hearing a bit about that because it does provide that further anchor point.
I think just and following on from some of the other parts to the conversation that we had that yeah, it is honouring ancestors. It's honouring our LORE as well.
Mm.
And again, if we and not wanting to kind of dwell too much on the impacts of colonization because we know that, but it's important to recognize that. Um, but also, it's really important for us to speak our own narrative and honor our own ways of knowing, being, and doing. and that respect for elders and ancestors and the knowledge holders who have set the path for us um, in, what we do in everyday life, how we care for country, how we care for self, how we care for others, are really fundamental values. And it is that responsibility of all of us to be able to take care and courage um, for our children and our communities, just as our ancestors have done beforehand. And that's what has, in my view, that's what's allowed for our survival. And I guess for us, it's also about instilling those really strong cultural values and sense of belonging and knowing of place to ensure that we have survival into the future.
Auntie Sheree, we're about halfway through the episode right now, and I believe it's very important we start to get a clear understanding of just what is kinship caring, just some of the key points, because we'll be fleshing those out as we go through the various episodes. Who and what is a kinship carer as well?
Yes, important to define and to be able to articulate. I want to kind of go back to some of the points that we made earlier, in that from an Aboriginal perspective, caring for family and community never sat on the responsibility of one person.
You emphasise that, yeah.
Many people, many roles, different knowledge and skills. Some might be nurturers, some might be skill developers, knowledge sharers, depending on, the different relationships, men and women's business, those types of things, ceremonial practices, if we think about that in a traditional context. So I think that in this contemporary world where we put pressure on families to be so insular,
Yeah.
and all responsibilities fall on mums and dads, when that's not really, generational living with grandparents and great grandparents is quite a familiar concept in many cultures. In Australia, we seem to have a thing about it. Like, it seems to be seen as a negative rather than a positive of having, multiple people contributing to the upbringing of family, sharing the load of life stresses and all the rest of those things. So kinship, in its informal sense, kinship caring is an extension of that. It's really important that to understand that sometimes the language around kinship caring, and whether it's a voluntary, more kind of informal arrangement to a statutory mandated arrangement, the relationships and the interpretation of that role may look a little bit different. And they're probably the two types of kinship carers that are really important to articulate. So sometimes people may find themselves caring for kin in an informal way, like they've kind of stepped in. There's probably some, concerns. So to help support that family, kinship carers kind of step in that way, but they're not mandated or in a statutory function.
One of the things that really comes to my mind in kinship caring, and I'm really happy to hear you expand on this for a bit, is the actual social and emotional well-being of the kinship carers, because regardless of the specific role they take in the young person's care and nurturing, because there's going to be a lot of pressure on that particular person, regardless of the role they have. So the social emotional well-being, yes, we're going to be talking about that extensively in episode 2, but just to get a bit of an idea, what are some of the key pressures and challenges that you've seen facing kinship carers over the years you've been involved in this area?
I think acknowledging the health and well-being of carers is really important.
Yeah.
I think also under that broader umbrella, that kinship caring can be quite an unseen and a thankless
Yeah, sure.
role being played within community. And I think the pressures that and life stresses that adds to a person can really impact on their health and well-being. And it's not uncommon for people who are providing that caring role that naturally they are caring people and or kind of taking on that responsibility. So often in a space, put others in front of themselves and their own needs are often, put to the back of the
And we
list.
know that's dangerous.
It's incredibly dangerous because if you're not healthy and well within yourself,
Yeah.
you can't be the best to support others. And the reality is, sadly, that the system that carers, kinship carers, and other carers have to navigate is quite challenging. It's quite complex. It's quite tiring. And they're some of the challenges that we see that have a really day-to-day impact on carers, having to navigate, negotiate, sometimes maybe fight is probably a good word about, basic needs for these children that they're caring for, whether it's access to good healthcare,
Mm.
whether it's access to specialist services, whether it's funding to be able to have trauma-informed care, even just basic kind of costs. And there's a real inconsistency across the state on what that looks like for different carers. And so when carers come together and have yarns about how they can help and support each other, you start to see a really fragmented system, not only child protection, but also, health and wellbeing care, the education system. Um, they all really struggle to be able to meet the needs of Aboriginal children.
You've mentioned the system in quotes a number of times, and there are various systems that we refer to. Quite often people say the system is broken. The system in reality works very, very well. It's designed to work as it does, but there needs to be reform of that system. And you mentioned that at the beginning of this particular episode. Very briefly, what are some of the key reforms that you believe need to be made when it comes to caring for the kinship carers and ultimately those young people for whom they're responsible?
I think a big part is the recognition of the role
Yeah.
that these people play.
And that's voluntary and also sort of not mandated, but those who are voluntary as well.
Yeah. In some situations, it's mandated, but also when you kind of step into that caring role, you're kind of in a little bit of a tricky space of you're not the parent,
Yeah.
but you're there having to make parent decisions, like what's happening in a school setting, what's the health and wellbeing needs, what's the best supports. And sometimes that decision making, which, you and I as parents can make quite freely,
Mm.
I don't like that school, so I'm not going to send my kid there. I had a bad experience at that healthcare provider. I choose to go somewhere else. That's not simple for children in care. Like there's a care team that make those decisions. And so the steps that you have to make to go through some of those basic steps of parenting, systems can't parent kids. Like that's the reality. They're not agile, they're not flexible in what you need to meet the needs of little people and not so little people, like when we think about teenagers and whatnot. But you need that in parenting. You need to be able to meet people where they're at. And so the system doesn't allow that really. And there are sometimes the thought around the voluntary part to it it's a little bit favorable in that way for the department to kind of go down a path of kinship caring. But the complexities of how that sits in places within community is quite challenging sometimes. How do you navigate the relationships of who can see who can be in the places where they can? And, here in Naarm, that might be a little bit easier because it's quite big. But once you go out into the regions,
New set of problems.
it's really quite challenging. And I think that also sometimes in those more formal relationships that it creates a lot of reporting and accountability that really restricts the carer to be able to do what they need to do. And in a practical sense way of the examples that I was using before.
Mm.
Like, I didn't like that GP. I want to go to a different one. You can't actually make those decisions without getting the clearing or the approval of the system. So it does still feel like there's a real power imbalance. It's not really empowering. Um, but in saying that, in our piece of work, in yarning with kinship carers, and some of the most amazing, dedicated, in particular, grandmothers that are looking after their kids. If I think about grandmothers against removal,
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
the staunchness of them. There's, some really amazing, fierce and staunch women who are really challenging those systems. And it's really important to acknowledge their advocacy and really the legacy that they're leaving to be able to change and take control of what is not always an ideal scenario.
And look, over the next 8 episodes, Sheree and I will be speaking to a large number of experts in their own particular fields, all relating to childcare and kinship caring. We'll be talking about things such as tips and tricks on dealing with trauma and difficult behaviour. We'll also be looking at ways in which you can better navigate the various systems that really impact on what you're seeking to achieve. But most importantly of all, I think, and you'd have to agree with me here, is that we need to keep hearing from these kinship carers out there, because these conversations never end. There are always going to be new challenges, there are always going to be new difficulties, and there will always be refinements to the system that will make it incredibly difficult for kinship carers to navigate and provide that appropriate care. I'm going to pass over to Aunty Sheree for a final reflection in just a minute. But what I encourage every listener to do is to check out the show notes for this particular podcast, which contain the contact details for VACCHO. If you've got something that you'd like us to yarn about, if you've got a specialist that you think we should be speaking to, then let us know. This podcast is here to help you, and importantly, here to help our next generation of young Aboriginal people. But before we do sign off, Aunty Sheree, some reflections from you.
Just to echo your point about this is the start of the conversation. It's not the end. So really welcome that feedback. Also, I think through the course of the podcast of this and the ones to come, we acknowledge the role of kinship carers and the important role that is played within community and caring for kids. We also wanted to acknowledge the importance of identity, belonging, and culture to children and the role that you play to support and nurture that. And finally, it's really important to look after yourselves, because you can't look after others if you're not at your best. And we hope that the future podcasts give those key points, or at least a starter to help navigate a really complex scenario.
And we will be focusing on that social and emotional well-being in episode 2. I just want to echo what Aunty Sheree said, the respect that we have, and that I can speak, I believe, on behalf of VACCHO, that everyone has for the amazing work the kinship carers are doing in ensuring that First Nations culture, First Nations connection to land and community are always first and foremost. Until next time, I'm Charles Pakana. Thanks for joining us.